Cypress Bend Plantation burned with candlelight and linen. The chapel bell rang midnight. White families filed in with psalms and fans. For them, it was God's night. For the enslaved, it was heat, breath, obedience. Sarah Johnson, 32, house servant, moved through it all like smoke. Her hands bore burn scars, her eyes, something older. Silence was her armor, her defiance. She polished brass for men who once crushed her brother's fingers for touching sugar. She boiled linens white for women who screamed at dust. She heard them sing, "Oh, come, all ye faithful," as if it meant something. In the dark behind the smokehouse, she kept something wrapped in cloth. It was not a gift. It was not for prayer. The chapel's gate bore an iron cross. Rust had weakened its hinge. Sarah had tested it that morning. It was loose now, hanging like a lie. She moved past the stables, past the chapel steps. The moss hung low. The air pressed down. Midnight had come, and with it, the hour. Sarah carried names, not in a Bible, not on paper, in her hands, in the bend of her spine, in the way she stirred the fire. Amos, 12, mouth too quick, back broken by Carter's cane. Old Ruth, bones like twigs, hang for charms carved in peachwood. Miri, her daughter, taken south barefoot, voiceless, soul without word or mark. Each one left something in her, ash in the lines of her palms, frost in her breath when she woke. They were not stories. They were ghosts. She moved through the kitchen quarters like someone walking across graves, each step a reckoning. The other servants whispered of her, but did not cross her. When she did speak, it was short and final, like a knife against a whetstone. But most days, she didn't need to speak. Her silence carried the weight of memory better than words. In it were screams swallowed and songs unsung. She had once been able to laugh. That had died with Miri. In the quarters, smoke from the hearth clung low, mixing with the scent of salt pork and wet cotton. Sarah sat near the low fire, mending a child's shirt that no longer had a child to wear it. Around her, women worked in rhythm, plucking hens, stitching seams, churning lye. Life didn't stop for grief. Grief simply learned to stitch. A girl no older than 13 leaned close. "You think they'll ring the bell 3 times tonight?" she whispered. Sarah didn't look up. "They ring for God. But if it rings for, then it's not for him." The girl fell silent. Outside, the wind carried a smell of iron and sap. The trees leaned like eavesdroppers. Sarah stood, folded the shirt, placed it on the shelf. Then she went out the back, into the stillness. Cypress trees lined the edge of the chapel like sentinels. The ground beneath them was damp, soft, red with clay. She knelt there sometimes, not to pray, to listen. Beneath the soil lay the forgotten, bodies placed without cross, without name, just placed, covered over, returned to dirt. But the soil did not forget. The earth had memory, and when she placed her hand to it, she could feel them, Amos, Ruth, Miri, vibrating through the roots. The white folks said ghosts were fiction, but they had never buried a child with their own hands. Sarah had, and so she carried them with her, not as burdens, as reasons. She knew every creak of the floor in the big house, every loose stone behind the chapel. She knew where the overseers hid their ledgers, where Tally kept his knife, where Carter wiped blood from his boots. She had been inside the walls of this plantation longer than any master still living. She had seen 4 owners die, 2 from fever, 1 from drink, 1 by a hand no one named. She had not cried for any of them. At the edge of the chapel gate hung the wrought iron cross. It was black now, stripped of shine by rain and sun. A week earlier, she had tested it when no one looked, just brushed it with her palm, felt the loosened bolt, the hinge rusted at the base. Too many summers, too many storms. Even iron has a memory. And weakness. She pressed her thumb against the lower arm of the cross. It moved. That was enough. Back in the quarters, Sarah lifted the floorboard beneath her sleeping mat. From beneath it, wrapped in cloth, she removed the gloves. Leather, soft, stitched by Miri before she was taken. She slid them on. No one had seen her cry since that day. She walked past the smokehouse, where Tally had once cornered her, where the girl named Lila had vanished, where boys went in and came out slower. The door was slightly ajar. She didn't look inside. Some doors do not deserve witness. Inside the chapel, the white folks gathered in silk and linen. The pews groaned under the weight of ceremony. A piano wheezed out Silent Night. Carter, Boone, Tally, Rusk, and Harlan stood outside, not to worship, to guard, to watch, to grin with stained teeth and mutter threats beneath breath, made sweet by brandy. 5 men, each with a name Sarah had whispered to the dirt. 5 different faces of the same order. Carter, whip always coiled, boots polished, cruelty methodical. Boone, loud, red-faced, violence before thought. Tally, smile when he cut, laugh when girls wept. Rusk, quiet, watched everything, eyes like cold nails. Harlan, the kind one, the soft voice, the sugar, the lie, each had left a mark. Tonight, she would answer them, not as a servant, not as a woman, but as memory made flesh. The candlelight flickered through the chapel windows, painting the yard with gold. Psalms rose and fell like waves on poisoned water. Sarah moved behind the hedge, where the iron cross waited. She reached for it with gloved hands. It lifted, not cleanly, but enough. She gripped the base and pulled. A crack, a whine of bolt and rust. Then silence. The iron came free in her hands. Heavy, cold. She cradled it like a child. It was not a tool of salvation. Not tonight. It was judgment. She looked once toward the chapel door. Inside, the white voices swelled. Joy to the world. But the world had not been joyful for Amos, nor Ruth, nor Mary, nor Sarah. She turned toward the yard. The wind held its breath. Time paused. And Sarah Johnson, born of silence, shaped by fire, moved forward, not as witness, not as servant, but as reckoning. The iron cross fit her hands like it had been waiting for them. Not the thin with the pews, not the copper candlesticks or brass bell rope. Iron. Rusted, cold, silent. Forged for permanence. Forgotten into disrepair. Like so much on Cypress Bend. She moved through the shadows behind the chapel, bare earth giving way beneath her feet. The wind was rising, soft, whistling through cypress and willow, pulling at the hems of dresses and the curls of lace bonnets inside the chapel. But outside, Sarah moved without wind, without sound, just the weight of the cross in her hands and the memory it carried. She passed the well. Boone had once pushed a boy into it, Jeremiah, age 9. The boy had survived but never spoke again. His mother had whispered, "The water remembers," and never drank from it again. Sarah turned her eyes from the lip of the well and pressed on. The path curved around the smokehouse, Tally's domain. The walls still bore scratches where children had braced themselves. He had a smile that bent, laughter that lingered in your ears long after he left. She paused here, pressed the iron cross against her chest, not in prayer, in preparation. Behind the stables, a rat skittered. The horses inside shifted, hooves stamping against packed mud. They sensed it. All things alive did. Something was turning. Something old and buried rising in the breath of a woman who had spent too many years unseen. Sarah stepped into the tool shed. It was dark, but she knew it well. She had cleaned it. Polished blades hung from pegs. Mallets, hammers, augers, saws. All the instruments of building and breaking. She rested the iron cross on a bench and took one long breath, filling her lungs with the scent of iron, oil, with dust and old blood. She looked at her hands, not shaking. Her mother once said, "When it's time, the body knows." She remembered her mother's hands, thick-knuckled, rope-burned, always busy. Ruth Johnson had been midwife and root woman, but never named such. She birthed 6 children, buried 3, helped others bring life into a world that crushed it. She'd been caught carrying a charm, a carved bone and a strand of red thread, near the barn. Tally had called it witchcraft. She'd been strung from the oak near the field's edge while the others were made to watch. Sarah had been 12. They said the ground shook that night, though no storm passed. The overseers said it was coincidence. Sarah knew better. Memory had roots. Roots grew down. She lifted the cross again, tested its balance. Too heavy for speed, but weight was truth, and truth did not need to hurry. Outside, the psalms were rising again. The second verse of It Came Upon the Midnight Clear. Inside the chapel, the white folks sang of peace. Outside, Sarah moved past the last hedge toward the outer yard. Carter was the first. He stood by the wagon, arms crossed, back turned to path. He wore his coat open, proud of the pistol hanging from his belt, but too slow to draw. He had killed Amos for talking back. The child had asked why only white children were taught to read. The cane had struck again and again, until it was the silence, not the blood, that stopped him. Sarah did not pause. The cross fell like judgment. Carter crumpled. She caught him before he hit the ground, lowered him with careless reverence, laid him flat, face to the sky, then moved. Boone was near the well, laughing, always laughing. A flask in hand, a curse in his throat. He saw her too late. Girl. That's all. The iron sang once. Boone's knees folded. His flask hit the ground before he did. The water in the well echoed, but did not answer. Tally was at the stables, arguing with someone unseen. He turned at the sound of boots on dirt. You dumb. But Sarah wasn't dumb. She was deliberate. The cross split the air, and Tally fell to the place where children had hidden from him. Russ was next. He had always been the watcher, silent, his hands clean, his eyes cruel. He liked to report, to record. He stood in the shed doorway, saw the shape in her hands. Didn't reach for his blade, only stared, like he knew, like he'd always known it would come. He whispered, "You'll hang." And Sarah said nothing, just struck. The tools on the wall clattered. Russ fell into them, head first. His eyes stayed open. Last was Harlan, young, soft, full of half-mercies and full rations. The white lady said he was gentle. The slave said he was not like the others. But he was. He'd watched and said nothing, offered scraps but never shielded. Now he stood between the chapel and the yard, heard the noise, saw the blood. He raised his hands. Empty! Sister, wait. Sarah stopped 3 paces away. He tried again. I never touched you. She answered. You watched. I never. You knew. I gave bread to your child. She starved anyway. He reached for a Bible in his coat, his last shield. You can't. She struck. Not the head, the chest. The iron hit ribs. The ribs broke. He sank without words. The chapel doors creaked open. Candles flared. The congregation turned. They saw her standing at the top of the steps, cross still in hand. 5 bodies behind her. 5 names erased. The white women screamed. The white men shouted. But Sarah didn't run. She sat down on the chapel steps, placed the iron across her knees, and waited. Inside, the choir continued. Rock of Ages, cleft for me. And outside, the ground remembered. Carter, Boone, Tally, Rusk, Harlan. 5 names, 5 weights. 5 men reduced to flesh and stain beneath the humid night. The white folk didn't run at first. They stared, frozen by the image of Sarah Johnson, seated on the chapel steps, blood darkening the hem of her apron, an iron cross laid across her lap, like scripture inverted. The hymn still rolled from inside the chapel. Rock of Ages, cracked and wavering, as if the voices couldn't decide whether to sing for salvation or scream. Then someone screamed. A woman with ribbons in her bonnet clutched her child to her chest and shrieked. Another fainted. A man bellowed for order. One of the younger sons reached for a pistol he didn't know how to use. Still, Sarah didn't move. She watched the chaos unfold with the stillness of earth. The iron cross, slick with blood, rested easily against her thighs. Her fingers curled around its base, not to threaten, but to hold, to remember, to ensure the weapon stayed real and did not become myth too soon. In the trees beyond the chapel, the enslaved had begun to gather. They had not been summoned. No call, no signal passed. But they came, slowly, quietly, as if drawn by gravity rather than will. A field hand with a crooked back. A wet nurse with her breast still damp from a child no longer hers. A boy too young to pick cotton, but old enough to fear the belt. They came and stood at the edge of the clearing, eyes wide, mouths shut. Their breath, held too long, came back to them in shallow bursts. They didn't cry out. They didn't celebrate. They bore witness. Inside the chapel, the singing faltered. The reverend, eyes wide behind his spectacles, stepped toward the doors. His voice trembled. What, in the Lord's name? Sarah looked up. I remembered. The words were quiet, but they cut through the psalm like a blade through cotton. The reverend blinked. You what? She stood. The cross scraped lightly against the wood. She lifted it again, not as weapon, but as truth. I remembered, she said once more. The congregation spilled out, white lace and polished boots meeting the dirt of the yard. Lanterns bobbed. Men shouted orders they hoped would sound like control. But none of them stepped forward. Not toward her. Not toward what she had done. The 5 bodies lay where they had fallen. Boone's eyes stared upward, mouth half open in surprise. Rusk's hand still reached for the shed wall, as if trying to write one final record. Tally's smile had finally twisted into something unrecognizable. Harlan, with his torn scripture, looked younger than ever. And Carter, silent, cold, lay closest to the wagon, where he had once kicked a girl for crying too loud. Sarah looked at them all. 5 named for judgment. 5 verdicts delivered without jury, without pen. Take her, someone shouted from the crowd. But no one moved, because Sarah had not run, because the iron cross was still in her hands, because the yard was not yet done remembering. She turned her gaze toward the gathered enslaved. Their eyes met hers, not in plea, not in worship, in understanding, in recognition. They had all remembered. A woman stepped forward. Her name was Dinah, midwife, had once stitched Sarah's shoulder after a punishment meant to break her back. She stood barefoot, hands empty. She did not kneel. She nodded. Then a boy followed, Jonas, no more than 15, with burn marks on his palms from the forge. He stepped beside Dinah, fists clenched. Then another, and another, until the edge of the chapel yard no longer looked like grass and dirt, but like something rising from the soil itself, as if the field had sprouted people instead of Cain, as if roots had taken shape and grown into bodies ready to be seen. The white folk backed away, not from threat, from truth. Still, no one touched her. The sun had not yet risen, but the sky was beginning to pale. The first birds began their soft mourning. Sarah lowered the cross. I'm ready. No one asked what she meant. 2 white men, sons of planters, stepped forward finally, awkward in their press coats, unsure of where to place their authority. One had a rifle, the other shackles. Sarah did not resist. As they approached, the field folk did not speak, but something passed between them, a soundless murmur, a current, the kind that ran beneath every prayer never spoken aloud. One of the men raised the iron shackles. Sarah lifted her arms. As the man clasped the cold cuffs around her wrists, his hand trembled. She leaned close. I ain't the first, she whispered. The man swallowed, stepped back. Then they led her away, through the yard, past the blood, past the white chapel, past the roots that had stirred. The iron cross remained where she had dropped it. At first, no one touched it. Then Dinah stepped forward, lifted it, cradled it like something living. She wiped the blood clean with her apron, wrapped it in linen, and disappeared into the dark. In Opelousas, the jailhouse had no name, just brick layered upon brick, mortar thick as bone paste, iron bars rusted from sweat and storm. It sat on the edge of the parish square like a mouth that never closed. Sarah Johnson arrived in silence, wrists bound, eyes forward. She walked past windows trimmed in lace, past parlors glowing with lamplight, past people who drew curtains with hands that trembled, not because she screamed, not because she raged, but because she didn't. The constable was a young man with too much chin and not enough time in the field. He looked at Sarah as though she were a puzzle meant to hang. The sheriff, older, bent by years of white laws, didn't speak to her, just nodded once and stepped aside. They placed her in the middle cell. Stone floor, one blanket, no window, just bars facing the hallway, where shoes passed without slowing. By morning, the news had grown wings. They said she'd killed 5 men without blinking. Said she had carved a cross into Tally's chest. Said her eyes burned red when they sang hymns. Said she was born of root magic and fire. No one mentioned Amos, or Ruth, or Mary. The trial was set for 3 days after her arrival, not because justice demanded haste, but because fear did. White men do not sleep easy when their order cracks. They need a name to blame, a body to bind, a lesson to show the rest. The courtroom smelled of sweat and starch. The judge wore spectacles he didn't need. The jury, planters, merchants, old men with old opinions, sat like statues carved from grudge. The prosecutor spoke loud and too long. Savagery in sacred space, he called it. A demonic frenzy disguised as righteousness. The young defender assigned to her hadn't shaved properly. He muttered about trauma, about unbroken grief, about the madness that grows when memory rots in silence. He read passages about slaves and souls, said her silence was a wound, not a weapon. When it was her turn to speak, she stood, faced them all, let them see her, and said only, "I remembered." The judge asked again. She repeated, "I remembered." The gavel came down like thunder. Death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn. She didn't cry. They placed her back in the cell. 1 meal a day, no visitors. But the corridor changed. On the first night, there was nothing. On the second, a strip of cloth appeared outside her bars, red, frayed at the ends, tied around a bent nail. No one saw who left it. Then came a corn-husk doll, then a twist of braided grass, then a bit of iron shaped like a heart. By the 4th night, the path to her cell looked less like punishment and more like a shrine. The guards didn't know what to do. They cleared the offerings each morning, but by evening they returned, quiet, simple, sacred. The morning before her death, the sky turned the color of pewter. Rain threatened, but held back. The priest came to offer her comfort. She declined. He asked if she feared hell. She said, "I've seen it." He left without finishing his prayer. She sat through the night, legs crossed, hands in her lap. No shackles. She didn't need them. Sarah watched the dark without blinking. When the first bird called, she stood. Outside, the gallows were already built. Fresh wood, clean rope. The crowd had gathered before sunrise. They came in silence, not for spectacle, but because they needed to see how rebellion ended, or how it began. Children clutched at skirts. Men wiped at invisible sweat. Women looked away as Sarah was led forward, step by step. She wore no shoes. Her dress was gray, her eyes clear. The sheriff read the sentence. No one listened. She turned to the crowd, not to beg, not to speak, just to be seen. From the back, a woman lifted her hand. 3 fingers to her chest. Others followed. 3 fingers. A signal. The one who remembers. They did not shout, but they stood. Dozens of them. Dozens more. Across the crowd, eyes met hers. She nodded once, then climbed the steps. The rope was placed. The priest whispered again, "Confess?" Sarah whispered, "They're watching." The lever was pulled. The body fell, but the silence did not follow, because a crow called once from the cypress tree, and from that single sound the memory spread, across fields, across quarters, across time. They buried her in unmarked soil behind the jailhouse, near the ditch where runoff soaked into clay and bones. No headstone, no prayer, no name. Just dirt and the silence of those who had seen too much. The sheriff wiped his brow, muttered that it was done, and never spoke of it again. The priest asked if anyone wished to say words. No one did. But that night, under moonlight, the dirt over her grave was found disturbed. Not dug, pressed, as though dozens of feet had stood there, in stillness, remembering. Back on Cypress Bend, the chapel doors were never open again. Not fully, not without creak. The pews warped from disuse. The hymnals, left untouched, gathered dust and wasps. And the iron cross was gone. None saw it disappear. No one claimed it. But those who worked the cane fields knew. Sarah had not run. She had not begged. She had not vanished into night or fled into swamp. She had done what none expected. She had waited, and memory, once awakened, did not sleep. By midsummer, rumors spread and whispers passed between rows. Some said the cross had been broken and its pieces hidden. Others claimed it had been melted into tools by a smith who never spoke again. But in the stables, a horse refused to enter the west stall. In the smokehouse, the floorboards buckled. At the well, water turned cloudy for weeks. The land had been disturbed, and the silence had changed. The enslaved, those who had watched her walk with the cross, those who had seen her sit on the chapel steps, those who had passed a corn doll or a nail into her corridor, began to move differently. Not loud, not rash, but with new center of gravity. Not fear, not hope, memory. At night, they gathered behind the smokehouse, not for song, not for story, but for stillness. Hands touched shoulders. Eyes met. No one needed to speak. I remembered, she had said. They remembered now, too. They remembered what Carter did to children too slow in the field, what Tally did in the dark, what Rusk saw and allowed, what Boone laughed over, what Harlan failed to stop. Sarah had named them by action, and now their names were weights in the mouths of those who had survived. The new overseer arrived in August. Young, thin-lipped, thought kindness could be a tactic, walked the grounds in clean boots and nodded too often, tried to use the word fair. But no one answered his questions. No one laughed at his small jokes. They worked as before, but something in their posture had changed. Not defiance, presence. They no longer flinched at his approach. They did not fear his silence. They had seen one of their own wield the shape of the chapel itself as vengeance. The bell in the chapel no longer rang. Its rope had frayed. One night, weeks after her death, 3 children slipped out of their quarters and made their way to the edge of the chapel yard. No moon, just heat and the sound of crickets. They placed a bundle beneath the steps, a stone, a dried flower, a wooden spoon. Then they ran. By morning, the bundle was gone. In the fields, an old man named Enoch tied red thread around his wrist. When asked, he said only to remember. A woman named Viola sang while she picked. No words, just a hum. Same cadence Sarah had used when boiling lye. A child pressed 3 fingers to his chest when asked to pray. The rituals grew. Small, unnamed, unstoppable. In town, shopkeepers noticed a pattern. Housemaid from different plantations lingered longer at the ironmonger's stall. Farmhands paid close attention to the weight of hammers. Blacksmiths found their coal piles lower than expected. And in one school, a teacher found a drawing beneath her desk. A woman holding a cross, eyes closed, standing over 5 shadows. She never asked who drew it. She never told anyone. By winter, the story spread beyond St. Landry. They reached the rice fields near Morgan City, the sugar camps outside Lafayette, a fishing village where no plantation ever stood, but where a woman wept when she heard the name Sarah Johnson spoken by a stranger in the dark. Not legend, something older, something known. They said she had not died, only changed shape, that her soul moved in storms, that her blood had soaked into cane and made it grow sharper, that the iron cross had not been broken, but multiplied, hidden in walls and wells and fence posts, waiting to be found when needed. And most of all, they said this: she did not flee, she revealed, because when she walked into judgment, she made it look like freedom, because when the bell rang and the psalms rose, she made silence answer louder, because in the face of order, she had not broken, she had remembered. The trial had ended before it began. Sarah Johnson, a servant, a woman, a slave, stood accused of 5 murders, and still the verdict came too quickly, like a sentence that had been waiting years to speak itself aloud. The judge read his script. The jury nodded like cattle. The rope was measured before the ink dried. They called it a spectacle of justice. But in Opelousas, they prepared for a ritual. The gallows were built on dry earth, not on courthouse steps, not in the square. They placed him behind the jail, far enough for denial, close enough for certainty. The wood was clean, the rope imported, the platform raised just high enough for the town to pretend it was looking the other way. But the soil beneath had already changed. No grass grew there, though they tried. The execution was set for dawn, and as the sky crept from violet to steel, the people came, quiet, reluctant, pulled not by vengeance, but by gravity. The sheriff stood to the side, chewing a stem of straw. He hadn't slept in days. The priest clutched his Bible so tightly the spine cracked. Beside him, a boy no older than 15 fidgeted. He'd been paid a nickel to sweep the platform afterward. In her cell, Sarah sat on the floor, legs crossed beneath her. No chains, no prayer, just the soft way of her breath and the smell of old stone and metal. She had not spoken since the verdict. She had not asked for mercy. She had not cried. Outside her door, offerings had continued to appear, corn husks twisted into dolls, bits of iron bent and smoothed, rags dyed with berries, tied into knots no white man understood, a spoon carved with the letter M, a scrap of ribbon, a folded page torn from a hymnal. Each morning the guards cleared them. Each evening they returned. On the day before her death, one offering appeared that no one removed, a bundle of roots, bound in red thread, left in the center of the corridor. No note, no explanation, but the guard stepped around it like it might speak. That night, the wind howled through the town. Not loud, just enough to rattle the old signs, just enough to make shutters creak, just enough to make the new gallows moan before anyone touched them. Sarah slept, and in her dreams the soil rose, not in flood, in memory. She saw Amos standing in the chapel, his shirt torn, holding a book he could not read. She saw Ruth tying herbs into her hair, her neck red where the rope had rubbed. She saw Miri, still a girl, still laughing, still whole. They said nothing. They only looked at her. And she remembered, when morning came, the priest entered her cell. He held out the Bible. "Would you like?" "No," she said. "Do you fear damnation?" "I've lived it." He swallowed, stepped back. The sheriff arrived with the deputies. He didn't look her in the eye, just nodded. "It's time." Sarah stood. They let her walk without binding her hands. The corridor was quiet, but the floor was littered with symbols. 3 lines drawn in ash, 3 sticks in a triangle, 3 fingers painted on the wall in berry pulp. No one knew who placed them, but they were there. Outside, the crowd had gathered. No one spoke. They watched her climb the steps. Her bare feet left no sound on the wood. At the top, she turned, not to face the noose, to face the people, to see. In the back, near the trees, someone lifted a hand. 3 fingers pressed a chest. Another followed. Then another. The priest whispered, "Speak your piece." Sarah looked toward the cypress line and said, "The ground remembers." The sheriff blinked. The priest stepped back. The hangman hesitated. The sun breached the horizon. The lever dropped. The body fell. The rope pulled tight, but the silence did not hold, because in the branches a crow called once, then again, and beneath the gallows a seed cracked open. By sundown, they buried her outside the cemetery wall. No stone, no blessing. But days later, grass began to grow. Sharp, dark green, coiled like braids. The townspeople cut it. It returned. They salted the ground. It returned. By spring, the grave was covered. Thick, wild, too dense uproot. Children played there, unaware. Dogs refused to cross it. And on certain nights, those who passed by claimed they heard singing. No voice, just a rhythm. Low, heavy, a psalm without mercy. The iron cross was never found whole. Some said it was buried beneath the chapel. Others claimed it was broken, melted, reborn. In the cane fields, blacksmiths hammered pieces into horseshoes, door hinges, side blades. Mothers tied threads of it into their children's braids. 3 fingers to the chest, silent signal. I remember. No statues were built, no names carved in marble. But in the smallest parish museum in Louisiana, behind smudged glass, lies a blackened fragment, warped, rusted, unmistakable. The plaque reads, Sarah Johnson, 1829. She turned prayer into revolt. That's all. Visitors pass it by, but those with old roots, those who know silence too well, pause. They see not the metal, but what it held, because memory does not rust. And in that fragment, the earth still speaks. It does not say her name. It does not need to. It only says, she remembered,